Hi, everybody. It's me again. We are going to start off just where we left yesterday when we had talked about the different civil liberties that the Constitution grants us, the different freedoms. Most importantly, we were talking about the 5 freedoms granted to citizens of the United States by the First Amendment. And today we're going to talk about the limitations to those 5 freedoms, which are seen as tenets, very important tenets of democracy, and so the limitations have often been questioned in courts, and the court takes very seriously violation of these rights. So we will just jump right into it because I'm sure it's not super entertaining to listen to me drone on, every single day. So we'll just go right ahead and start off with the first one. So our freedom of religion, right? We have the freedom from an established national religion and the freedom to exercise religion. And this freedom has very few limitations and can essentially only be limited when there's a compelling interest to do so in order to protect the common good and limit people's abilities to harm others. For example, you can't go and give somebody a swirly in the name of religion. That's just not how it works because that's causing harm to somebody else, and it's not allowed. Like, that's a school rule. However, if you wanted to sit out in the hall and pray or meditate after you saw somebody getting bullied or saw something that made you sad, then that's totally within your right to go out and take that time and exercise that religious belief. So this free exercise clause has often been questioned in the court, and precedents generally holds that the federal law is superior to religious practice, meaning if the federal law says you can't go out and shave people's heads off because they made you angry, well, you can't break that law. You can't violate the law in the name of religion and say, well, this is what I do. This is my religious practice. My religious belief is to shave people's heads off once they've, I feel like they've wronged me. But there's a law saying that you cannot do that, and so you are not allowed to do that. This cartoon over here is depicting a case. I believe it was 1878. Sorry, and it's the Reynolds versus U.S. It was a case dealing with polygamy, which is polygamous marriage, which is the marriage of a man to more than one woman. And that was a common practice in Orthodox Mormon communities. And basically, they went to court saying a law against polygamy is a violation of my religious practices, my religious belief in polygamy. And essentially, this case, they decided that the free exercise of religion has to be within the bounds of the federal law. And it isn't a violation of the right to religion because it is not meant to infringe on a specific religion. So the court in this case ruled that Congress could not outlaw the belief in polygamy, but it could outlaw the practice. And this is because marriage is often regulated by law in civilized nations, and so people may not avoid a law due to their religion. So there has been very little limitation, and it's generally when it comes to the question of, will this religious practice break an established federal law? So the freedom of speech is something that has often been questioned, violations, or whether or not something is a violation of freedom of speech. And an individual's freedom of speech can be limited in circumstances when the speech may prove harmful to others. And then also, one's freedom of speech is protected from intrusion by the federal government, but it doesn't protect citizens from restrictions on freedom of speech that come from private industries, individuals, or organizations. So, for example, if your employer can prevent you from saying, writing, or wearing certain things, and that will not constitute a violation of this constitutional right because you didn't accept that job. In the Constitution, you don't have the right to speak freely when you are under contract by an employer or you are going to a private school where there's a dress code. It's limited in situations where the federal government is not the one limiting that. And so the court has found that if someone's speech is being restricted due to the content of that speech is generally a violation. So what this means is that if someone is being restricted from speaking on a certain topic or speaking from a certain viewpoint, then there is more likely that it will be a violation of their right to freedom of speech. And then so the court has found certain types of speech to be of low First Amendment value, which means that these types of speech are less likely to be found protected by the amendment. And these things are true threats, which means threats to commit a crime. Those are often not protected. Fighting words, so words that are likely to lead to an immediate fight and cause harm to people, they're likely to be restricted without constituting a violation of the amendment. And then commercial advertising can also be restricted if it's deemed as misleading. And so that's another thing that's kind of low on the value of, the freedom of speech right. And then the government can also restrict the freedom of speech rights of employees of the government and students in public schools. And we will discuss that further in a few days when we talk about the rights of students in schools. So the government is also able to restrict speech when it's done without regard to the content or the message of the speech. So this is referring to content neutral restrictions, which are restrictions under a less demanding standard because they apply neutrally to all speakers without regard to their message. So you're not banning a person from speaking specifically about this thing. It's just content neutral situations. And they're considered less threatening to the right of free speech and the concern that the government shouldn't be able to intrude and restrict certain spoken ideas and not others. So when it is content neutral, there's a little bit more leeway for governmental restriction of this right to freedom of speech. Okay, so the next one is the freedom of the press. So this is something that has often been questioned in the court. The first limitation that was placed on this freedom was the Sedition Act of 1798. And this was an act that allowed for criminal prosecution of anyone who brought the press or the government into disrepute. This might seem like an obvious violation of the right to free press. However, it was not brought into question until 1964 in the New York Times versus Sullivan case. And this case was a key step in protecting the freedom of the press, which, remember, is a huge pillar of democracy because the press is supposed to inform the people of what their government is doing, right and wrong. And so it's very important that, this right is protected and it's not limited, that the government doesn't have control and that we have access to a free press. So this case was a key step in protecting the freedom of the press when the decision buried the idea that speakers or publishers could be punished for the criticism of government under the theory of seditious libel. The court voiced that the ideal was a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. Meaning, the court said, essentially, the Sedition Act is ridiculous because the people need access to a press that will talk about public issues in an uninhibited manner, that will set the truth straight and that has very little restrictions. And this case also established the actual malice test, which essentially requires that a public figure demonstrate recklessness or deliberate falsehood by the news media before there really can be anything done about it. And so the Richmond Newspapers versus Virginia, that is a case that's really interesting because it focuses on the public right to a free press rather than the right of those in the media to information. The question was whether or not the press has a right to be in a courthouse and see a case. And it's essentially said that the court providing media access to information and events is almost like a proxy for the general public access, but the right to be there belongs to the public and not exclusively to the news media. So saying essentially the press is not the one guaranteed the right to be there. It's the people who are able to be in these public forums. And it sort of says that the news media isn't afforded extra privilege because they're the news media. They have the same rights as all the people. But yeah, so we'll look more into in a worksheet, like different ways that the freedom of the press has been restricted and whether or not, it was a violation or not. And then the next one is the freedom of assembly. And so this freedom to assemble has always been faced with limitations. And the first one was actually written in the amendment. And that guarantees the right, saying that the right to peaceably assemble is a right. Okay.